How did the Ottoman Empire shape the modern world? Historian Alan Mikhail will be here to talk about his new book, God's Shadow. What really goes on in the supermarket? Benjamin Lorr will join us to discuss the secret life of groceries. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 16th. I'm Pamela Paul. Alan Mikhail joins us now. He is in New York City, and he is the author, most recently, of God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire, and the Making of the Modern World. Alan, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
This book is about the Ottoman Empire, which I think for many Americans, certainly young Americans, it's sort of encountered in the history textbook when it's in its waning years, World War I. It's sort of the dying empire that, is obliterated at the end of World War I, along with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But what was the Ottoman Empire like at its peak?
At the height of its power, the Ottoman Empire ruled three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Some 33 countries today have an Ottoman history. It was an empire mainly of three religions: Islam, the religion of the ruling elite of the empire, and at the height of its power, the majority of the population, but also Christianity and Judaism. It was a multi-linguistic empire. The languages of the Balkans, of the Middle East, and of parts of Africa as well. And it was one of the world's great powers of the early modern period.
When you talk about the early modern period, what years do you mean specifically?
Roughly, we're talking about 1500 to 1800.
Okay. And the subject of this book is really looking mostly at the 16th century, right? The 15th and the 16th century?
That's correct. Selim, the protagonist of the book, lived from 1470 to 1520.
Tell us about Sultan Selim, also known, I love this, as Selim the Grim, and as God's Shadow on Earth, and I'm assuming thus the title of your book.
Correct. Selim is the father of perhaps the most famous sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the ninth sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was born, as all sultans were, to a concubine mother, and at the time, a Ottoman prince who would become the sultan later on in Selim's life. He was born in the city of Amasya, which is in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And he was the fourth of his father's 10 sons and not favored to succeed his father to the throne. And much of the story of his life is how he outmaneuvered his older and more favored brothers to eventually become the sultan, which he becomes in 1512. And he rules only for 8 years, a very short period of time. But in those 8 years, he expands the Ottoman Empire more than any other sultan in the 600-year history of the empire. He makes the empire for the first time in its history a majority Muslim empire. He is the sultan who gives it the shape that it will have until World War I.
Why isn't it him? Why is it Suleiman who is the better known sultan?
Suleiman is a very important sultan. I don't want to take anything away from him. He rules longer than any other sultan. It's under his reign that the empire achieves the kind of height of the arts, where it's at its most involved in European affairs. It is during Suleiman's reign that we have an enormous corpus of source material of correspondence between the Ottoman Empire and various European powers. And those were some of the earliest sources that European historians used to tell the story of the Ottoman Empire. And therefore, they gave a lot of attention to Suleiman. One of the things that I argue in the book, though, is that it's because of this enormous expansion during Selim's reign that Suleiman is able to achieve everything that he does during his reign.
How much territory did Selim conquer?
When he takes the throne, the empire is an empire basically of the Balkans and the western half of Anatolia. So if you think of modern-day Turkey today, the middle of Turkey over to the Aegean Sea. Selim adds to the eastern half of Anatolia, so all of modern-day Turkey. What we conventionally think of as the Middle East today, so the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, parts of Iraq, down into Saudi Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia, and then over in North Africa all the way to modern day Algeria. So from Egypt over to Algeria. So it solidifies the Ottomans as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. After this defeat of the Mamluk Empire, which is the empire that held all this territory before, the Ottomans control basically the Mediterranean coast from Algeria, following all the way around close to Venice.
And what was the guiding principle of his territorial expansion? Was this economic? Was it about spreading Islam? Was it just about power?
I really think it was about his ambition and his desire for territorial conquest to be the major power in the region. When Selim is younger, he is the governor of a city in eastern Anatolia on the Black Sea. And it's there that he really is introduced to some of the enemies that he will come to fight later in his life. So I really do think it's about his own personal ambition for expansion and power.
All right, so tell us a little bit about who he was and why was he Selim the Grim?
The sources that we have of Selim's life are, the bureaucratic sources that he promulgated orders and appointments and those kinds of things. We have some of his poetry and we have some correspondence that he undertook. And then we have people who are observing his life. So from that, we come to see that he, again, was someone who turned the disadvantages of his life, being an unfavored son, into an advantage. He thought that the empire should be militarily aggressive and not defensive. He struck out against enemies on the eastern border of the empire when he was governor of this city on the Black Sea. He was maniacally focused on getting to the throne. So that meant that he bucked many trends. One was the trend of non-favored sons becoming sultans. Another was that he himself, as best we know, there's some historical debate about this, had only one son himself, Suleiman, to save his one son the succession crisis and battle that would dominate so much of Selim's life. And he was known as the Grim because he was quite violent as both a governor and eventually as a sultan. And I want to be careful here not to ascribe any more violence to a Muslim leader than we would to any other leader in this period. This was a very bloody period in world history. The Inquisition is going on at this moment. European powers are executing people in public squares and these kinds of things. So Selim is very much a piece of this world. He kills eventually his half-brothers, his rivals for the throne. He also deposes his father, which was a very unique thing in Ottoman history. Usually succession only occurred once a sultan died or was physically incapacitated for some reason, and he forcibly deposes his father. So this idea that he's the Grim is one that comes out later in the later writings of Ottoman historians to describe this period in which it was thought we don't want a system whereby sons are deposing their fathers left and right. We want succession to occur in a very ordered and deliberate fashion, whereby it only happens when a sultan has died or is otherwise, as I said, incapacitated. And so that moniker is given to him in the later writings of Ottoman historians.
And yet, as you point out, this was a time of the Inquisition. Yet Selim, you say, fostered diversity and encouraged toleration of the Jews and other minorities. Was this a major departure from earlier sultans? And was it an anomaly, presumably, at the time?
It is not. That is one of the striking things in thinking about the Ottomans in comparative perspective. So the expansion that Selim achieves during his lifetime, as I said, makes the empire, for the first time in its history, a majority Muslim empire. The majority of the subjects of the empire are now Muslims. Up to that point, the majority of the people living in the Ottoman Empire were Orthodox Christians of one kind or another. So this is 220 years of Ottoman rule. The ruling elite of the empire are Muslims, but the subject population are Christians. So 220 years is a very long time. That's almost as long as the United States has been in existence. So the Ottomans were very good at fostering communal autonomy, giving the Orthodox Christian communities of the empire autonomy over things like marriages and divorces, some property relations, dealing with their own affairs. not imposing Islam in any kind of violent way on the subject population. There's also a large Jewish population already present in the empire, which will only increase after 1492 and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Many of those Jews eventually end up in the Ottoman Empire. And after 1492, the largest Jewish city in the world is in the Ottoman Empire, Salonika, Thessaloniki in today's Greece. So unlike Spain, for example, the Ottomans never attempted to forcibly convert their non-Muslim populations or to expel them from the Ottoman Empire. I don't want to overly romanticize confessional relations. There were plenty of anti-Jewish instances of violence in the Ottoman Empire and anti-Christian as well. But it is the case that in comparison to powers in Europe, that the Ottoman Empire fostered a kind of ecumenical polity whereby non-Muslim communities were able to do quite well underneath Ottoman rule. And I'll just say here that Selim is also known as the Grim because he undertakes one of the largest domestic massacres in Ottoman history up until the end of the 19th century. And that is against other Muslims in the empire, specifically Shiites. So one of the major wars that he undertakes during his reign is against the Safavid Empire in what is today Iran. And they are an empire that ties their rule to Shiism. So he very much sees, because of the Safavid enemy, Shiism as an enemy to his own power in the Ottoman world. And so during this war against the Shiites of Iran, he massacres some 40,000 of his own Shiite subjects.
This tolerance on the part of Selim and his Ottoman Empire was not reciprocated in large part by Europe, right? I mean, this was the time of the Inquisition. How largely did the Islamic world loom in the minds of Europeans at this time?
Hugely. And that's a very important part of the story of Selim and his age, because he expands the empire so much, nearly tripling the size of the empire. There's this sense in European capitals of an encroaching, threatening Islam coming from the East. We might argue that that was a long-standing obsession of European Christians, but in Selim's age, that really ramps up. So, for example, someone like Columbus, and I spend a good deal of time in the book speaking about Columbus. Columbus is born in 1451, so a couple years before Selim's grandfather, Mehmet the Conqueror, conquers Constantinople. At the time, one of the popes describes this as plucking out one of the eyes of Christendom, the eastern capital of Christendom. And so for someone like Columbus, he's raised in this world in which Islam is a threatening force that has to be dealt with in some kind of extreme way. This is redoubled for him when he starts sailing around the Mediterranean and his first forays outside of the Mediterranean. He sails to North Africa. He sails to an island in the Aegean. He sails down the west coast of Africa. And everywhere he goes, he sees that Islam is present and that Christendom seems to be in the retreat. And he's present at the conquest of Granada in 1492, that other major event that happened in 1492, whereby Isabella and Ferdinand conquer the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, uniting Iberia under Catholic rule. And this for Columbus is a piece of what will come to be the Atlantic voyages. He thinks of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the conquest of Granada, and sailing west to try to find a route to India as all pieces of this kind of global march of Catholicism around the world. So we often say that Columbus was looking for an alternative route to Asia, but why was he looking for an alternate route to Asia? That is because of Muslim power in the eastern half of the Mediterranean.
In your book, you write, whether politicians, pundits, and traditional historians like it or not, the world we inhabit is very much an Ottoman one. What do you mean by that?
I mean that if we look at major world-changing events of this period that have resonances down to the present, so Columbus, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of commercial relations, that the Ottomans have a hand in all of these things. So it's not as though Columbus didn't cross the Atlantic, of course he did, or that Martin Luther didn't lead a Protestant Reformation, of course he did. But there are Ottoman and Muslim elements to those stories that we have ignored or not paid attention to. And so a lot of the work of my book is reinserting Islam and the Ottoman Empire into those stories to give us a fuller and I would say more empirically true story about all of these events that we think have something to tell us about the making of the modern world.
How and when did the Sultan die? I mean, you mentioned that he only ruled for 8 years. And did the next Sultan, Suleiman, carry on his legacy, or did he then undo things or make changes?
Selim dies in 1520. Interestingly, he had fled Istanbul because of a plague outbreak, much like many of us have done. He fled the city to get away from a pandemic. And historians argue over whether he died from plague or some other disease, but he died due to an illness that his doctors couldn't treat, and he died at the age of 50. As I said, he only had one son, so Suleiman's succession to the throne was very easy. And Suleiman, in many ways, does carry on the legacy of his father. He continues to gain some territory for the empire, a little bit in Hungary, a little bit in Iraq, but he really consolidates the territorial expansion that Selim achieved during his reign.
You mentioned in a kind of throwaway line that Selim wrote poetry. Of course, this is a books podcast, so we can't just ignore that tidbit. Was his poetry any good?
Poetry, to my ear and eye, is not very good. It's mostly about his conquests, talking about what a great leader he is and all the territory that he conquered. It's certainly not the height of Ottoman poetry.
One final question for you. You, in addition to writing this book, you are a professor of history at Yale, where you chair the Department of History. What's it like right now teaching history at Yale University and chairing a department? Presumably, you're not all back in class.
That's right. We're teaching almost exclusively over Zoom these days. Our classes are tending to be smaller this semester, which is not such a bad thing. But of course, there's the oddity of doing it over the screen. We live in a time in which the President of the United States has gone after the teaching of history in both secondary and post-secondary education. That's something that many of my colleagues have very strong feelings about. And I think this is a moment where history has to be taught, and we have to stress the importance of thinking about the complexity and what some might term the negativity of history as an integral part of the study of our past. There are many things that we might not want to have to think about in any kind of serious way, but I think it's absolutely, obviously important that we deal with the history of this country and the history of the world in all of its complexity and nuance.
I couldn't agree more. Your students are lucky to have you, even if only over Zoom. Alan, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you very much.
Alan Mikhail's new book is called God's Shadow, Sultan Selim, His Ottoman Empire, and the Making of the Modern World. Benjamin Lorr joins us now from Brooklyn. His new book is called The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. Ben, thanks so much for being here.
No, thanks so much for having me.
This is actually a weirdly well-timed book, right? Because everyone is obsessed with the supermarket right now during quarantine. We are all scared to go there. We must go there. We are all cooking all of our food. You planned all this, right?
Yeah, this was like my dark nightmare. I've been obsessed for years, but I do think the pandemic provided kind of a perfect on-ramp for everyone else to kind of realize that this banal institution in our lives was actually vitally important and that understanding it was something that would be really interesting.
In reality, Ben, you've spent 5 years researching this book, right? Not knowing there would be a pandemic. What got you interested in supermarkets and what took 5 years?
Well, there was a kind of a light bulb moment that stemmed right off my last book. So my first book explored the Bikram yoga world in this obsessive group of yogis. It turned out that the guru was kind of a megalomaniac narcissist, also that turned oddly relevant after the book came out. But I was at a teacher training there, and there were a group of yogis who had been kind of trapped at this teacher training with the guru for a long time, and they let them out to go supermarket shopping. And they all descended on this Trader Joe's in the area with a maniacal glee that I just hadn't seen in adults. It was like going to the amusement park with a busload of kids, only it was a supermarket. And it was, and I just thought, oh, there's this odd parallel between this book that I'm researching now on obsessive yoga and this kind of cult and this cult of food that has kind of grown up around me, and the way that we place meaning on food in an interesting way.
So where did you go from there, sort of noticing this cult-like Trader Joe's thing going on?
Well, I mean, I will say that was a light bulb moment that I wanted to write about it. But for a long time, I've been fascinated by supermarkets. I am the type of person who will go to a supermarket on their vacation and just browse around. I think there's almost a hallucinogenic quality with these saturated, bright colors and the fact that you walk down the aisles, and to me, it's both soothing and comforting. All this choice and abundance and like Miracle Land, but also there's a power that radiates out of them, and it's almost threatening. So I had long been drawn to the supermarket, and I wanted to scratch the surface. So I started by just interviewing as many people as I could, from just people I knew who had worked in there, and just kind of working up the ladder of talking to someone and asking them who I should talk to, because it's such a sprawling industry.
Well, you're speaking to the right interviewer here, because I, too, am obsessed with supermarkets and always go to the supermarket, at least one supermarket when I travel. One place I know that you did go to travel is Thailand, where in the supermarkets, there's always a full aisle dedicated to baby powder. But you, it says a lot, because they do wear a lot of baby powder in Thailand, and there are many different kinds. You also went to Thailand as part of your research. What brought you there?
So I was interested in exploring the bottom of the commodity chain, and Thailand is one of our most integrated, prominent partners in terms of seafood. And it was really important to go and get the physical experience, because so much about trade is misleading when it's on the level of kind of physical reports and annual reports and charts. I had this image of the supply chain in my head that kind of mimicked one of those flow charts, and it was nice and clean. But on the ground, when you're dealing with the volume of commodity that it takes to run a grocery store, which is premised on the notion of continuously available abundance, right? The supermarket manager is phobic of this idea that there will be a stock out, that there will be a shelf that doesn't have the item that has been promised. So
the quarantine has not made them happy.
No, it's like it is truly a nightmare for them. But it also exposes somewhat the extent that the customer doesn't care that much about this. But to create that abundance requires such a volume. And to go back to Thailand, it is something that is not captured well by these companies themselves, the importers and the exporters and the manufacturers that rely on the bottom of the commodity chain. The supply chain itself is so big that it's less like clear lines and more like a thicket of different interlaced, interhatching things that produces places that, unless you really go like with a reporter's eyes to study, it's hard to get to the bottom of. Manufacturers don't often know where product is coming. They use aggregators to get to the true smallholder. So fighting your way through that thicket was something that I thought was really important.
And what did you find when you were in Thailand about the food chain that you maybe didn't expect?
I was there focused on traffic labor. And I think at the bottom of the supply chain, I found just truly horrific abuses that I think the fact that they exist in 2020 would surprise almost everyone, from people who were literally bought out of prison and kept at work on a fishing boat for years at a time against their will, beaten when they didn't work. There was really no other word in my mind than slave to describe them. And then what was, I think, unexpected about this portrait was that how active these people were as agents in their survival, and how little their predicament involved them being tricked into something terrible. But the way that global inequity works and their struggle for a better life often led them into these positions with eyes not exactly open, but with far more human agency than I think comes across in some of the NGO reports that I had read ahead of time.
Can you connect the dots between those fishermen in Thailand and, say, the seafood display of Whole Foods, which is where you actually start your book?
Yeah, and I do some time working at a fish counter at Whole Foods, at front-of-end retail.
You were undercover, right? What does that
Yeah.
mean?
In general, as a writer, I try to get as close to my subjects as possible. I want as much first-person experience. And so, for the Bikram book, I ended up doing gobs of Bikram yoga. And for this book, I thought if I'm writing about the grocery store, I have to get on the grocery floor and do some work with customers.
You can put the weight back on that you took off doing hot yoga.
Precisely. Although it's a fish counter, so, it's relatively healthy, although you couldn't afford that fish on the salary we were making, for sure. But to connect the dots from Thailand to the retail counter, I think one of the big messages of the book is that's really hard. And even people within these companies who work in quality control and do this for a living can have trouble with that line. There often isn't a clear line of visibility with complex supply chains like Thai shrimp, which is where I really honed in on, because the boats where these men were imprisoned were collecting what's known as trash fish as only part of their job. They were out there fishing for other fish as well. But trash fish are small fish that would usually just get pushed right off the boat. But because we have this burgeoning aquaculture sector that is raising carnivorous fish and shrimp, it relies on actual wild protein. And so that trash fish then gets turned into fish meal. And that fish meal gets turned into shrimp food, which is itself a discrete property. Then that gets used to raise baby shrimp, which then go through several stages of production and are kind of swapped around the country as they grow from tanks to ponds. And then those are taken to processing plants, which exist in a variety of different structures for final processing, and then to exporters, importers. At some point in that last phase, a label gets slapped on them and they get the country of origin label and they get perhaps a brand label. But that's very late. And at that point, they head to the retail counter.
All of this sounds sort of okay. Was there anything incredibly unappetizing or disturbing about this process? I mean, are you still eating shrimp?
It all sounds sort of okay if one can put the enslaved fishermen at the bottom of the chain, out of sight, out of mind, which is something that I think the entire system is geared to get you to do, and all those different layers of production help at. But I think another big takeaway from the book is just how efficient this is. And the shrimp and the fish that we were selling is perfectly hygienic. Moreover, although a lot of people have read the book and have come to the conclusion, well, now I need to add shrimp to, it's another thing that as a good middle-class person I should not eat. I got to add it to the list along with like slave-grown tomatoes. That's really not the takeaway I intended from the book. I think I intended to show just how horrific these conditions were on the bottom of the supply chain, but also how intractable they were and how reliant they were on certain structures that need to be changed. And those structures are big ones, from trade treaties to really global poverty inequity that is driving the migration that drives these men's trapped lives. So there are no quick or easy solutions there. And it can seem okay only in the way that it can also seem helpless at the same time, maybe a learned helplessness.
So another tale of the dark side of globalization.
Yeah, I think the ability to outsource this certainly helps that. Although another major section of the book I visited with truckers, which as recently as the 1970s was a middle-class job, Smokey and the Bandit, gruffy and lovable, but had been in very close parallel to what was happening in Thailand, reduced to a job that a lot of the truckers I was with called their job sharecropping on wheels. I don't think it was an overstatement. They were trapped in a system of debt peonage where they were grinding out poverty level wages for working 70 hours a week and were not free to leave because they had taken out loans on a truck and were beholden to the trucking fleet that had leased it to them.
How closely connected to those kind of worker policies are the supermarket chains themselves? I mean, we started talking about Trader Joe's, which positions itself as a kind of good company. Whole Foods, of course, is owned by Amazon, which does not allow for unions, at least in the warehouses. I don't know if there are unions in the Whole Food stores. What's the labor policy like at these stores, at the major chains?
In terms of how they treat their own workers, it can vary. And there are certainly chains that have good labor policies. I think there has been a rise in, certainly when I was working at Whole Foods, we felt this effect. Although these policies weren't at Whole Foods proper, they kind of defined the labor market in terms of treating employees as more on demand. So, back in high school when I had a minimum wage job, you'd still get the schedule a few weeks ahead of time. So you could kind of plan your life or maybe get another part-time job. That's no longer the case. And you're getting your schedule 3 days ahead of time. The hours that you're working are being shifted based on kind of big data algorithms that are predicting customer demand. And so the hours you're working could vary by up to 40% week to week, which of course means your take-home pay varies 40% week to week. That type of, quote, just-in-time scheduling is certainly extremely problematic. But to the larger question of like connecting grocery stores to the plight of the trucker I was talking about, or the Thai seafood traffic laborer, that gets really tough because these chains are not designed for that type of supply chain overhaul. I talked to NGOs who specialize in that sector and admitted openly that they just barely were understanding how you reform a complicated supply chain. And I think as consumers, there is this notion that we can vote with our dollars and make change with money. And, I think unfortunately, one of the takeaways I had is there is no great conduit for doing that through the supermarket. And that's a bit of a foodie fantasy and a very self-serving one when you start to think about it. Oh, I can buy something for myself and make the world better. It turns out that that's not totally the case, or at the very least, supermarkets are not the way to do that and are not well equipped to do that.
Well, full disclosure, as I think I've talked about on this podcast before, I worked in a supermarket when I was in college, and it was one of my favorite jobs ever as a cashier. I loved working at the cash register. So it's distressing to me to hear about the just-in-time policies. How prevalent are those? And does that mean that working the cashier is no longer a kind of viable after-school job for teenagers, for example?
Just-in-time in nomenclature is changing because it's kind of gotten a bad reputation and people realize, but the practices that underpin it are very prevalent. Because these are low-wage jobs, at Whole Foods, where just-in-time did not happen in name or company practice. But we were always told that we were team players, and we had to be team players, and we had to play for the Whole Foods team. And there was this subtle notion that if we weren't playing for the Whole Foods team, like we might have to be asked to play for someone else. And sometimes they would ask us to do these just-in-time things, and we should just do it. So there's a soft coercion. And I do think the idea that the job that you were working in high school is not the job that's available anymore. There's a nostalgia that's not helpful. I talked to a seafood supply chain expert who said something about, she was like, the biggest problem is when you go to the store and you pick up a can of tuna, it looks just like the can of tuna that your parents or your grandparents were buying. But the way it's produced is completely different now. And I think that's true for these minimum wage jobs where it's easy to say like, well, I did that, but that's not what's happening anymore. And moreover, it's not just high school kids who are working these jobs. These are now full-time forms of employment for adults.
I mean, with a lot of these companies that rely on minimum wage workers, the profits are often pretty sweet. I mean, how much money do supermarkets make? You would think that for Amazon to make the decision to go into this, it would have to be a pretty high margin market.
Well, they make a tremendous amount of money. It's $700 billion a year industry. And it is such an institution in our lives. We spend 2% of our lives in grocery stores, that it also is a great platform for launching other things, which would obviously make it very attractive for someone like Amazon. In terms of margin, however, it's a very low margin industry. It's just premised on volume. And that's kind of the great genius of the supermarket, that we're going to sell at such volume we can reduce prices down to create kind of a buying frenzy where people put more into their cart than they intend because it's just low priced food. So margins tend to go from 1.5 to like 3.5%, which is razor thin. Of course, and it's something that I get into in the book, supermarkets find other ways of juicing their bottom line. And the modern supermarket operates much more like a landlord leasing space out, something called slotting fees, where they will sell shelf space to entrepreneurs. And I'm not talking about end caps at the end of the aisles, where I think we all know that those are probably sold because they're very visible, but shelf space anywhere in the store. And that just goes right to the bottom line, and it's not included in margin.
You did a lot of research for this book, including, and we haven't talked about this, you took a USDA class, which, I mean, I didn't even know that you could take a class with the USDA. What did you learn about supermarkets that most surprised you? I mean, I just have to ask that question because there are so many interesting factoids in this book.
I learned too much to figure out what my most surprising fact is. Now, I mean, I could give you the line I give everybody. The book was just so sprawling. I was blown away by trucking. Like, I think I've driven on those highways next to truckers all the time. I had no idea the job requires that much vigilance. I had no idea it was so dangerous. More deaths than any other profession are in trucking. And yet at the same time, I had no idea about the debt peonage and the idea that a lot of these truckers are grinding it out. That was shocking. I spent time with Joe Kalum, who founded Trader Joe's. And I think the other really surprising thing was just how connected grocery branding was to my identity, how much the store is acting to serve the consumer. And so however much we might scorn this giant system, it's working on our behalf, kind of bending on both knees down to serve us. And that was something that I didn't go in with. You know, I think the dominant foodie narrative is like there are these big, greedy corporate places serving us plastic food. And that there's truth to that, but it wasn't in the grocery industry. This was full of people who had good intentions, who were trying to serve consumers, and who consumers were asking totally contradictory, chaotic things, making that service extremely difficult and ending in dark places, you know, that we discussed in Thailand.
You talked about the fact that the just-in-time scheduling is, if not entirely going away, certainly under scrutiny. Are there other major trends in the supermarket industry that you think are going to really shape the direction of our future grocery store on the corner?
The pandemic is accelerating a giant push into online spaces. And so I think that trend is going to continue, and it's going to shift what the physical store looks like. Will we need a giant 200,000 square foot Costco-like space to get things? I'm not sure about that. And I think we're going to see a lot of smaller format stores that start excelling at the things that the online world doesn't do well at, like small, interesting specialty goods, voyage of discovery type stores, seeing little stores that you already kind of see for boutique-y things, but kind of like your best friend's, your most clever friend's pantry. Like, I think those type of stores are going to start popping up at the same time as we see this shift to buying a lot of our staples through more routine online purchases, because the pandemic has kind of cemented that for a lot of people.
One last question, a personal question, but you brought it up. You said that, you know, your local market, like your market of choice, ends up kind of shaping you and serving you. What's your local supermarket or your supermarket of choice, Ben? And what does it say about you?
Oh my God, it says terrible things about me.
What does it know?
It knows that I'm lazy, that I go for convenience, that despite the fact, and it is why I hope this book never comes off as preachy, because I really am very comfortable with human flaws. But I go to the supermarket that's closest to me. It happens to be a Union Market. It's pretty bougie. They play Herbie Hancock in the aisles because they know that that's the type of music that I bop my head to and will make me linger a little longer. They have an insane assortment of mushrooms and chili peppers, which I think is fantastic, but it's also one of those choices that they've made because that's the type of thing that I value and will then overlook the fact that they're way upcharging me on any type of branded content that I would get there. Like the cereal is atrociously expensive, but I walk in because they have this Herbie Hancock and this great display of mushrooms, and it's real close. And those are the values that I represent when I'm shopping, and they have big consequences for the world.
Well, you know what, Ben? That mushroom chili pepper supermarket actually sounds pretty good to me. So I think you have nothing to be ashamed of.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Benjamin Lorr is the author of The Secret Life of Groceries, The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
What's going on this week?
So we're getting a clearer picture of how the publishing industry has withstood the pandemic and shutdown. And as we've discussed before, some of the news is very encouraging. So the Association of American Publishers released their latest numbers that show book sales through August and compare them to the previous year. And they noted that trade sales, which excludes educational materials, were up really substantially, almost 7% year over year, which is kind of crazy when you think about all the challenges that there have been to the retail ecosystem, supply chain, all that kind of stuff. And, there was a huge fall off of educational materials. So that's one area of the industry that is still struggling quite a bit. I think they showed a decline of nearly 14% for K through 12 instructional materials. And then university presses were also down slightly. Higher education course materials were down. But if you're looking at sort of trade publications, fiction, nonfiction, they're pretty much up across the board. Adult books were up nearly 6%. Children's and young adult up nearly 6% as well. So that was encouraging, and we've continued to see a rise in print sales from NPD. I think the question that a lot of people have, and one of the alarming things now, is just this major shift in where and how people are buying their books. So there has been, real strain, particularly on independents, as more people are shopping online or shopping at big box stores and they're buying books when they go there. A lot of independent stores are struggling. And our colleague Elizabeth Harris had an excellent look at the fate of independents in a story that she did this week for the paper. She talked to some of the stores that have been struggling and are looking at the holiday season as kind of maybe make or break for them. A lot of independents, I think, count on holiday sales for something like 30% of their annual revenues. Mm-hmm. So this is something that a lot of people are worried about. On top of that, they're concerned about getting printed books in time. They have all these additional costs because they're mailing books to customers instead of selling them at registers. So they're selling a fair number of books, but they're spending a lot more money to do so. A number of booksellers were part of this coordinated effort this week that was led by the American Booksellers Association to sort of get the word out that, we do need your business and we need your help. Some are even just raising money, not just selling books. A lot of independents that participated in this outreach effort put up signs kind of pegged cheekily to Amazon's Prime Shopping Day, where they give major discounts. And so some of the signs said things like, if you want Amazon to be the world's only retailer, keep shopping there. So they were really sending up an alarm and asking people, if you care about your independent store, if you want this to exist in your community, you really need to shop here or help us out.
Earlier in the pandemic, you reported on a new website called bookshop.org that is selling books on behalf of many of the independents. How is that going?
So that has continued to grow, and that's been, I think, a positive development, one of a sort of silver lining, if you will, from the pandemic, because they were prepared to launch this year anyway, but they'd always hoped to kind of present themselves as the independent alternative to Amazon. So if you want to shop online, come to us and we will either direct you to an independent that you can buy from, or you can buy it from us, and they raise money and share it among independents. So at this point, they've raised more than $7 million for local bookstores. So it really came out of the gate kind of right at the start of the pandemic and got a ton of attention. And I think it's been a good channel, a good new sort of sales channel. But bookstores don't do quite as well when they sell-through bookshop. They don't have to handle any of the merchandise, so they don't have any upfront costs, but they don't get as much money because, again, they're not selling directly. So
Right.
it's not necessarily going to be a solution long-term. It's sort of a nice supplement, and I think it's a good addition to the retail ecosystem, particularly as more and more people are shopping online. But I think independent stores often say, we still need your direct sales and your direct support.
Well, I had the good fortune of getting a day off a couple weeks ago, and I went to a nearby independent store, which I got to visit by appointment only. And I have to say, I really, really miss bookstore browsing.
Yeah.
But one nice thing is that I went with my cousin, and this store is allowing one, household or grouping in at a time. So we had the entire store to ourselves, and it was really great personalized customer service and really nice to, be able to search for, a full half hour. So I spent much more money than I was intending to do, but I felt good about it in the end.
Exactly. We can all feel good about spending money that way. Plus, there's so many good books out this fall. There's
Oh my
too
God.
many.
Too many. What are you reading, Alexandra?
I just finished a book that had been on my radar, but rose quickly to the top of the list because it's a finalist for both the Booker and the National Book Award, and that's Douglas Stewart's Shuggie Bain. And it's long and it's absorbing, so it's really, I think, exactly what I want to be reading right now.
Wait, give us the 2-sentence summary. What's this about?
So this is a story of a boy who's growing up in public housing in Glasgow in the 1980s. And he is the primary caretaker for his single mother, who's a really severe alcoholic. And although his circumstances almost couldn't be worse, he suffers from bullying. He's gay, but doesn't quite know it. And he gets picked on, and he's lonely, and he has to skip school to make sure his mother doesn't do something terrible to herself. It's also very funny and very sweet and tender, and it's almost a love story about their relationship. And the language is beautiful. There's incredible dialogue. So right now it's been a wonderful distraction from the news.
Well, you've distracted me, Alexandra. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, Parl Sagal and John Williams to talk about what they are reading and reviewing and thinking about. John, Parl, thanks for being here.
Hey, Pamela, thanks for having us.
Parl, let's start with you because you did an interesting thing recently. You reviewed an audiobook.
I did. I reviewed Fauci by Michael Spector, a staff writer at The New Yorker, who, wrote a profile of Dr. Fauci, who he's known for decades. And the profile for The New Yorker came out in the spring, I think in April. And it's now been expanded into an audiobook. And I was interested in both about the sort of backstory of Dr. Fauci. I didn't know very much about him. And also, the experience of, well, why make this into an audiobook? This article that already felt pretty comprehensive, pretty detailed. So I had a really interesting experience last week where I was learning a lot about Dr. Fauci and also really trying to think about why put the article in this medium. And increasingly, you see journalists moving over to podcasting in so many ways. So it was a real chance for me to sort of think about also what are the advantages of that particular medium.
Well, what medium is this? It was released by Pushkin, which is a podcast studio, released as an audio book, as you say, built on an article. What is this thing?
So it's very faithful to the article, first of all. So it's the same structure, takes you from Fauci's early years to the sort of presence that he's had during COVID, and then kind of opens up to talk about pandemic preparedness or our lack of pandemic preparedness. Now, the audiobook sort of augments this with a lot of archival footage and, you can hear Fauci's voice, you can hear some conversations. Now, the idea that this is a biography is a bit of a misnomer. So Fauci, the access to Fauci was very tightly controlled by the White House. Spector and Fauci, who have known each other for a very long time, I think talked a few times on the phone. They didn't meet in person. The book doesn't really go into some of the questions that I invariably have as a very nosy person, and especially about somebody like Fauci, who's had this life where he's worked under 6 administrations. He's seen so much. He's really worked within these corridors of power. He's had some huge transformations in his own politics. No, maybe not his own politics, but in how he regards medicine and regards his own position. So for the sort of psychological backstory, there isn't much of that. It's more a sort of story of his public life and what he exemplifies that Spector is very interested in. So this idea that Fauci is somebody who throughout his life has been characterized by this very rare trait in life, which is an open mind and an ability to be persuaded by facts. And he'll change his mind, he'll change his course. So this is the sort of personality trait that I think Spector really seizes on in this book and says, how rare this is and how important this is and what a sort of lost art this ability of good old-fashioned trust and interest in the facts really is.
Now, this came out in his response, his initial and then revised response to the AIDS crisis.
Absolutely, yes. So he was part of the medical establishment and became sort of the public face of the government's inaction, indifference. And part of this was related to the fact that there was a very, very hidebound system of clinical trials, that if you were on an experimental drug, you could not take another experimental drug, which the activists were protesting. They were saying, look, we have people dying. Let them have access to some kind of medication. Let them not have to choose between dying blind or dying, all of these things. And so Fauci in the beginning was resistant, but there's a moment in the audiobook and in the profile where he really started to listen to the voices of the activists. And he thought these are primarily New Yorkers. This is Larry Kramer. This is ACT UP. And he said that why are they so angry? Why are they taking to these measures that Fauci considered histrionic, in fact? And then he said, let me listen. So he went to an ACT UP meeting. He went to Moore. He went to San Francisco. He went to the Castor. He met these men and he started to listen to them. And he started to see the sorts of unbearable choices they were going to have to make. And he reversed course. He said, look, these activists actually know a lot more than we do in certain cases. They've become students. They've been forced to become students of their own disease. He made this transformation that really flabbergasted a lot of his colleagues. There was a whole lot of what the hell has happened to Fauci? He's sort of sold out. He's become an activist. But it was a case of him sort of looking at the evidence and saying that this is not the best course of action. And what Spector does is he says that, well, why haven't we been looking at the evidence? We're entitled to a lot of feelings about COVID. We're entitled to our grief. We're entitled to our feelings of panic. But should we be surprised? I don't know if we're entitled to surprise. And so he starts to chart the long history of pandemics around the world, all the lucky breaks America got from SARS, from swine flu. What did we learn? Did we learn anything? And will we learn anything from COVID if and when this thing comes to an end? Not if and when it comes to an end. So this is the way that the story refracts and opens up. Even though biography may not be the most accurate word, it becomes this really interesting way to ask a lot of these questions, and for Spector in a way to reflect on his long career reporting on epidemics all around the world.
Was the audiobook the best medium, do you think, to tell this particular story?
Well, I don't think it has to be the best. I think there's so many mediums that the story has been told. I was actually surprised in the beginning about how moving it was to even hear Spector's own voice. He doesn't have the best sort of narrative he doesn't have a typical audiobook voice. It feels like somebody reading a little bit at times, but because it didn't feel professional in this way, and because he was talking about his own work and his own relationship with Fauci, his own relationship with Larry Kramer, it felt emotional. It felt exasperated at points. It felt authentic in a way that I started to appreciate. And I think that there is also something very powerful in hearing the voices of the activists, in hearing Fauci's own voice, in hearing their accents, in hearing how New York a story this is in certain ways. All of this sort of made a more intimate experience, a feeling of, it felt less rarefied. It didn't feel like this is something happening in some other place, some other sort of corridor of power. No, this is happening very much here between these people that are personalities and who know each other and have worked together and been antagonists for a long time. So, it worked for me. It worked very, very well, and made it seem it vivified it again for me, made it seem more real again.
All right, I want to ask a question actually from one of our listeners and ask it both of you and John, also of you. So this comes from an email from Bruce Kendall, a longtime listener of the podcast, who says that recently he's found that books are sort of easier to listen to, better listened to than read. And I think he started thinking about this after listening to us talk about Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. He says, Trevor Noah speaks the voices of the characters in Born a Crime, most memorably his mother, in a way I could never, ever imagine. And then he writes, the other author who immediately comes to mind is the great George Saunders. I listened to Lincoln and the Bardo, a fairly experimental novel with a cast of notable and rather talented narrators. Saunders also narrates a part and is, to my mind, by far the pick of the bunch. When I hear Saunders narrate, I hear the construction of sentences, the music of his prose, in a way I could never recreate in my reading of his work. This I found true of his short stories as well. George Saunders is better listened to than read. Perhaps it is my mind playing tricks on me, recognizing the voice of Saunders and believing that his narration must be ideal. He wrote it. I suspect not, having listened to many other authors narrate their own work. Many are very fine writers, but truly awful narrators. So here are his questions. He's curious to hear your positions on reading versus listening. And then he has some kind of fun, really open-ended questions like, what long dead author would you like to hear read their own work, and which book would it be? Over to you, John.
Oh, God. It's a lot of questions. I can make some of this very short because I almost never listen to audiobooks. And in fact, I'm not sure I've ever listened to a full audiobook. I wish I could say in a sort of, antagonistic way that this was a bias against them. It's more just the way I think that my listening brain is built. I remember this all dates back to about 25 years ago, probably. I bought the cassette tape, at least 25 years ago, of The Accidental Tourist by Ann Tyler, which I had read and liked. And I saw that John Malkovich did the narration. And at the time I was, in sort of a John Malkovich phase. He was in a bunch of movies I loved. And so I thought, okay, I've never done this, and so I'll try it out. And of course, at the time I was driving around a lot in my car and I would listen to it. The problem is that I found that I'm such a huge music listener. But what I realized very quickly is that, and of course, this makes sense, is that my mind very often drifts when I listen to music. So you'll be in the car and you'll hear 3 songs on the radio, but one of them didn't even really register. You'll think, yeah, I heard that beat for a minute, but I forget actually the process of listening to it. And so I would just phase out. And then a minute later think, well, I have to rewind now for the plot and the story, and I don't know what happened. So I think I became too accustomed to music being background for me, and I couldn't bring the attention I needed to listen to an audiobook because I was always doing it while doing other things. And so I've never really gone back to it. But I do also have a natural bias, I think. I like having tactile books around, and I like underlining things in them and going back to them. And I just, that's my reading life, and it's very hard. I'm an old man now, so it's hard for me to change.
You're only an old man in spirit, John, but you're not alone in this. And I think especially when I'm driving, if there's an audiobook in the car, then it's really hard because wait a minute, is this the turn or is that the turn? And whatever I was listening to is just gone. We would listen to, I remember there was a period, and this may also have to do with having 3 young children in the car, but we'd be listening to Edith Hamilton's mythology, and at a certain point it'd be I don't know what god or demigod this is. I don't know what land we're in. I just would get hopelessly lost.
Yeah, and if you are paying attention and you're riveted, then you miss your highway.
So it's something's got to go, and I'd rather not die in a car crash. Parl, something tells me you're more skilled on this front.
I'm just still laughing at John being old only in spirit, which is so true.
I greatly appreciate that. That's on my business card.
I think I've written about this. I actually learned to read with audiobooks, and my mother was a very, great reader and extremely impatient. And at some point gave me the audiobook of Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier and the audiobook read by Claire Bloom, and was sort of have at it, work it out. So I've grown up with audiobooks, and I can drift between the two very seamlessly. I still listen to a lot of audiobooks. I actually like to listen to audiobooks and to people talking while I write, which I understand is very perverse. But I think I grew up in a very loud house and loud cities. So I'm very comforted by the sounds of just ambient conversation and argument. In terms of people that I love, as much as I love reading Toni Morrison, her audiobooks are sublime. And she really, really put so much work into the voices of the characters.
But she reads them?
She reads them. And
Wow.
you hear things that you don't, that I didn't pick up when I read her. I pick up the irony, the slowness sometimes. She does incredible voices. And you can really hear how some of her sections are put together more like music like prose. Like they're poems. They're not stories exactly, and you can hear the repetition. There's a real caress in her voice. They're really fantastic. Especially Sula, I would highly recommend. For years and years and years, I just would have it on, and I highly recommend that. I also recommend. I mean, I don't recommend listening to this one if you have roommates, as I made the mistake of doing when I was in grad school. I loved the Jeremy Irons rendition of Lolita, and my roommate at one point asked me to stop because I would like clean the house while listening to Jeremy Irons read Lolita, which I really didn't understand could make anybody so uncomfortable. I mean, I think I'm so hardened, I suppose. And so she was just like, I understand that this is something you enjoy and this is part of your cleaning ritual, but can you not? And so I chose them. I didn't. And now
that sounds like a really good match. Irons on Lolita.
It's fantastic.
I want to ask Bruce Kindle's question again, though, of both of you, because it is an interesting one, hard to answer on the spot. But who long dead would you like to hear read their own work?
Oh, gosh, easy. I want to hear Melville reading Moby Dick, and I want to hear Marianne Moore reading her poems. And those are the two. I think for Marianne Moore, I would love to hear just how funny some of these poems are, or just how wounded. And, we project so much onto this poet who is very reclusive and evasive and hidden. And I would love that sort of insight. And then for Melville, I think just to hear him, how the sentences, those rolling sentences and chapters sounded to him, where he would take a breath, where he thinks some of those sentences at, I think would be lovely.
Now you're making me think that we should listen to Faulkner too, right? I mean, wouldn't it be amazing to hear how he wrote some of the, how he imagined some of, the bear and the other stories in Go Down Moses to kind of go that language?
Oh, The Sound of the Fury too, like all of those tumbling sections and that first person and those voices for sure. And then can I make one more recommendation for audiobooks for people that might be interested, especially if you have little kids? Kate Winslet has read a few of the Roald Dahl books, especially Matilda, and they are fantastic.
You know what, Pearl? We're going to have a fight.
Oh, no, you hate them?
No, but have you listened to Roald Dahl read them?
See, this is where I don't know if I could, because I have complicated feelings, as everyone does, about Roald Dahl, and I love the books, but I think if I hear the voice, I worry. I don't know how I'll react. Tell me about his reading.
Well, you need Kate as like a kind of like an intermediary, you mean? So it's not like a direct contact. I mean, despite whatever one's feelings are about Roald Dahl, the person, and I think it's generally known he was not a nice person, the way he reads his own books is so amazing. He's got that, like weirdly Norwegian tinge, sort of British accent, and he reads very, very quickly. And once I heard him read his stories, I couldn't listen to those, the Kate Winslet, the Emma Thompson. They have a great lineup of talent who reads those books. But for me, it's Roald or no one.
Now I'm intrigued.
I love Kate Winslet, so that's like she's John Malkovich for me now.
You're on Pearl's side. What about you? Who would you want to hear?
I was going to say, as long as we're going hypothetical, I was going to swing for the fences and say, give me Homer reading the Odyssey. But then I realized I wouldn't understand a word he was saying. So I would still sort of maybe say, I don't know, Shakespeare reading his sonnets or something. I'd love to hear just the really like Melville on Moby Dick, the kind of biggest of the big. Why not? I think a lot of people who I like probably wouldn't sound that great. I mean, I'm a big fan of people who are pretty crabby and who I don't think... I wouldn't imagine them to be very performative in terms of bringing something alive off the page. And then I would everyone can mute me. I'll just say for 20 seconds that, I would love to go back and be in person when William James gave his Varieties on Religious Experience in Edinburgh and just hear him read them live because they were lectures that later became a book.
One note on the Shakespearean sonnets. Apparently, Patrick Stewart is reading these aloud in some kind of social media venue. I don't remember which one. And they're supposed to be quite good.
Right. I think I just saw someone link to one of those, but I didn't open it up.
Pearl, I apologize for picking a fight with the Roald Dahl reading. I will be more open-minded to Kate.
I had it coming. I'm sure.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.